let's move on to this. The winter initiation season is currently in full swing, and once again, it's been marred by tragedy. A 6-year-old boy died at an initiation school in Limpopo. It's believed that the boy's parents actually consented to his attendance despite him being underage. So the Center for Child Law at the University of Pretoria is calling on government to align the Limpopo Initiation School Act to national legislation. For more on this, let's bring in the organization's Stanley Malematja, who joins us in our studios this morning. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for popping by. And it really is a tragedy, isn't it, that we can almost predict around this time of the year when we're speaking about initiations and the deaths of boys there.
Yeah, you know, thank you for having me. I think as the Center for Child Law, it's important to start at the end, to state what we are not saying. What we are not saying is that culture is wrong. Cultural practices are provided for in the Constitution, they are protected. Now, we should remember that immediately when we are dealing with children, we need to take into account their best interest. Now, when I was reading through this and I saw a 6-year-old boy died at an initiation school, and the COCTA, Limpopo, comes and says they've contravened Section 12 of the Limpopo Schools Initiation Act. I was like, wait, hold on. What's happening here? So the Act says that a 12-year-old can go to an initiation, provided that the parent has consented and also that there's a medical certificate by a medical practitioner. Now, the problem is that the Limpopo Initiation Schools Act is not aligned with the Customary Initiation Act and also with the Children's Act. Because what the Children's Act and the Customary Initiations Act say is that no child under the age of 16 can be admitted into an initiation school. Now, it is important to state that the Customary Initiations Act, it gives provincial legislatures the power to legislate laws, right? But those laws, they cannot set an age lower than 16 for children who have to be admitted.
That makes sense, right? Because, I mean, you can't have a situation where the country says the limit is 16 and then the province goes and changes that to 12.
And we should remember that by law, provincial legislation is subservient to national legislation. And also, even in the Constitution, it's stated there. Now, we need to remember also what the Customary Initiations Act says. It says that provincial legislatures must enact legislation in line with this act, and they must enhance the best interest of the children and protect the children. So immediately when we are dealing with a situation where children are involved, we need to make sure that the laws that are there to protect children actually bring the most ultimate protection.
Absolutely. So before we had to take a bit of a breather from our discussion, you were explaining to us where national legislation is and provincial legislation is around the level or the age of consent, really, for people to be able to go to initiation schools. I imagine the plan is to try get these two pieces of legislation to speak to each other, then past each other.
Absolutely.
How do we get that right?
So, you know, look, it's important, number one, to say we do commend provinces having legislation to regulate certain practices such as initiation. However, it is important that we try and align these two. Now, how do we align it? Now, we have Section 28 of the Constitution. It is not only a right, it is a principle and it is instructive. It says to us, when you are dealing with any matter concerning a child, the best interest of the child must be of paramount importance. Now, how do we check the paramount? What do we say when we say paramount? Where do we look? The provisions of Section 7 of the Children's Act 38 of 2005 is very instructive as well. It says that when we are considering the best interest of the child, some of the factors to take into account is the age, development, and the level of maturity of the child. Now, we cannot have a 6-year-old. Remember, when you go for initiation, you are removed from parental care.
Right.
We cannot have a 6-year-old being removed from parental care, all in the name of tradition or a cultural practice. Cultural practice, yes, important, but it should not be at the peril of children. The Constitutional Court has long established the right to childhood. As it is right now, we are losing children because they are exercising their right to play. Now, we cannot at the same time be losing children to the practice of culture. Now, the Limpopo government, what they need to do, first they need to concede Their act is that of 2016. There's a national legislation of 2021. There's like about a 5 years gap. Now they need to ask themselves, in this 5 years, initiations have been taking place, but under their own legislation, and they've been neglecting a national legislation that says, number one, a child must be 16 or above. Number two, there must be a medical certificate by a practitioner. And that medical certificate must be attached to a written consent by a parent in order to constitute a proper admission of a child into initiation for purposes of initiation.
Got you.
Yeah.
Sure. It's very interesting because, I mean, what does this 5-year period say about whether or not the Limpopo government may have been on the right side of the law? I mean, if they've been practicing using the provincial legislation, which is clearly in breach of national legislation, what does that say around who needs to be held accountable, especially because now there's been a death? And
you see, also, we cannot ignore accountability. Someone must be held accountable. We cannot have our leaders, especially the MEC, visiting such places where tragedy happened, and they are referring to an archaic legislation that is really outdated, especially at the peril of children. So people need to start doing their work. When national legislation is out, they need to start doing their research. They need to align their legislation with the national legislation. Now, let's say, for example, we didn't have the national legislation of customary initiation. We do have the Children's Act. Right. It is very instructive. It says that we need to give maximum protection to the rights of children. So in other words, we need to make children's rights a reality. Now, we cannot, and we do understand, the parent said that, okay, I wanted my child to be accepted in the community. We do understand those stigmas. But at the same time, we cannot have parents who are just running behind stigmas and putting their children in danger. That is a 6-year-old, like, we really need to think about it. Even if we say he was going to enter the passage of manhood, what is a 6-year-old going to comprehend of that entire situation? So as parents, we need to protect children, but most importantly, as leaders, as the legislature, we need to align our legislation with the Constitution, number one, because it is very instructive, and we also need to look into the Children's Act. There are those guides. You cannot have a provincial legislation that says 12 years, then have a national legislation that says 16. We need to marry the two, and we know that according to the law, provincial legislation plays a diminished role as compared to national legislation.
If there is a conflict, we need to err on the side of what national legislation is saying.
Absolutely.
Got you. The reality, though, Stanley, in a country like ours, is that you can have all the right laws in place, harmonized, as it were, and still have people ignore them for all kinds of reasons. Stigma is one of them. As a center that has an interest in protecting the safety and health of children, how do we improve at least that element? The fact that the laws are one thing, following them is something else.
I think that's a very important question, and I must thank Newzroom Afrika again, because this is the platform where we get to speak to the people, where we get to tell people about the law, right? Where we take the law out of the court and bring it to the people. So we are speaking in layman terms here. I'm trying to explain as far as possible that, number one, we are dealing with children. Number two, you need to have the necessary consent. Number three, we need to align the laws and make sure that they marry each other. We need to remember that as South Africa, we are governed by the Constitution. Above the Constitution, there are also international treaties relating to children's rights that we have signed and ratified. And we need to remember the reality, as you've spoken in South Africa, children are one of the most vulnerable members of society. Now, what does that mean to us? It means that as adults, as the legislature, as government, we always need to walk on the path of protecting these children to make sure that they enjoy their childhood. We cannot have a child of 6 years old being subjected to that, because we are depriving this child of a lot of things. Not only was this child deprived of the right to life, and we need to understand the right to life is a non-derogable right. What that means is that a limitation to that right can never pass constitutional muster. There's no way you can go to a South African court and say, we limited the right to life because of 1, 2, 3. That will never pass constitutional muster. So we always need to remember that laws need to marry each other. They need to speak to the Constitution.
What is heartbreaking in this particular story around the 6-year-old in Limpopo, and I'm not quite sure if you have any details around it, exactly what happened, is that the parents consented to that child going there. I mean, that just gives us an idea of the journey we need to travel still.
And you see now, let's speak to the issue of consent. That consent is invalid. Because why? The law says that the child must be 16 years and above.
Right.
Any child who's below the age of that, your consent is invalid. You cannot consent that your child be initiated or attend initiation school. And actually this topic, it actually touched home because it happened a doorstep from my village.
Right.
And I myself, I'm speaking as a legal practitioner, I'm speaking as a person who's invested in children's rights, and I'm also speaking as a person who has walked that path to say that, you know what, we really need to have laws that speak to the Constitution. It's fine, let's practice culture, but not at the peril of children.
My understanding that the 6-year-old apparently also had epilepsy. I mean, let me speak to you as someone who is in a community like this, who also happens to understand the law. Where do you think the gaps are in bridging what the sentiment of the community is and what the law demands of us, quite frankly?
I think, number one, we are in a different, quite a unique legal system in that we are governed by, common laws and statutory law. And at the periphery, we also have customary law. Now, it's been a journey. South Africa has been on a journey to marry customary law with the Constitution. And we are still walking there. But what I'm saying is that at the same time, while we are walking there, we must not do it stagnant. We must do it with agility. We must do it with a purpose to say, okay, we have identified that children are the most vulnerable groups. How do we then incorporate customary law? It's fine, let's teach them the custom. But how do we incorporate that to make sure that children understand and apprehend the society that they are brought up in, and also to do away with stigmatization, to say if you didn't go for initiation, then you are not man enough. We need to do away, with that. And I think that also, it takes a lot of public education. And with that public education, it also speaks a lot to government, national, provincial. When you are going to a community to say that you are responding to this tragedy, it is important that you don't refer to outdated laws.
Absolutely.
You need to do your research. You cannot be in a community and say they've contravened this act. Have you checked your act against what the Constitution, the Children's Act, and the Customary Initiations Act say?
You know, that saying around it taking a village, hopefully it begins in your village and we get these things right. Thank you so much for coming in and speaking to us. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Stanley Malematja is with the Center for Child Law at the University of Pretoria, speaking to us really about a nuanced issue, the harmonization of provincial and national legislation in order to protect children as best as we can. Once again, Stanley, thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you for having me.